Hello, ministry company, family, and friends. We are heading up towards the end of this walk through the book of Ephesians. We're headed into chapter 6 starting today, and I've just loved going through this book and seeing how Paul, first he lays down such strong theological points through the first half of the book, and then he starts laying down all of these practical ways to live it out in our lives. And we see him talking about unity in the body, about being a believer who walks in that Christian conduct, and then he starts putting it into our life in such things as marriage and family and our sexuality. And now in chapter 6, he starts heading into with children and with parents. And I'm going to start reading chapter 6, starting in verse 1. It says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth." And here he lays down just a simple fact that children, I don't know how many children will be watching this at this point, but at some point maybe the children will get to watch this. And as a parent and as an adult, I think a lot of us grow up and then we come to the realization if we had just obeyed our parents a little bit more, when we didn't understand what they were leading us to and we had followed that advice, we would be better off. You hear about like learning lessons the hard way. And as a parent, my goal is to have my children not learn those lessons the hard way, but to take my advice, take my guidance, and walk in that. And what here's Paul saying basically that's a biblical principle, that when you obey your parents, when they give you guidance, and you follow that advice, you're actually making your walk easier. You're making less room for barriers or for things to go wrong. And that goes beyond just listening. I think sometimes we can think, as a kid, if I say to one of my children, I say, "It's time to clean your room," and they can say, "Okay, I'll clean my room." But if they don't actually go and clean their room, that's not obedience. That's just replying with an answer, and that's not honoring. It says further on that you honor your father and your mother. And honor is not with words. We can try and honor with words, but honor has to be backed up with action. So as children, that action is to obey your parents. And Carly and I love to tell this to our kids. It drives them nuts, but that delayed obedience is disobedience. That if you don't listen when I tell you to do something right away, you're actually disobeying. And that's a lesson that's hard to learn, even as adults, as Christians, that when God leads us to do something and he tells us to do something and we say we'll do it, but then we delay or we hesitate, that's disobedience as well. We honor the Lord, even as adults, by following the leading and the example that he gives us and by listening to his guidance. And then Paul flips the script. He goes to the parents and he says in verse 4, "And you fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord." And here we have training and admonition. So training is showing them the right things to do, being that example. And admonition is that warning. It's telling them that if they go down this road or if they do these things, that they're putting themselves at risk, that they could get hurt. And as a parent, it's first and foremost, we're called to shepherd our children. We're called to guide them and lead them. And I like how he says, do not provoke them to wrath. That just gives that sense of gentleness. And if we're talking about shepherding as a parent, the shepherd has a rod and a staff. And one is for discipline. One is for, guiding the sheep, for making sure they're in the right way. And then there's the staff as well. And that's not just for discipline, but also for protection, that we're protecting our children by guiding them. But it has to be with that gentleness. And that can be hard with parents, especially because a lot of the times children reflect our own flaws back to us. I know as a parent, you see things in your kid and the way they act out or the way they disobey, and you can see a reflection of yourself, maybe even as a child, and you've matured in that, and that's why it frustrates you because you want to see them mature in that, or because you're still struggling with that as well. So it's important not to push our children's buttons. I know it can be easy to escalate it that way, where we know that if we push the button, it's going to escalate and maybe they'll obey a little bit faster, but they aren't going to be doing it with the right heart anymore. They're going to be doing it out of anger or malice, that we do it in gentleness. And that will actually cause our children, even if it takes a little bit longer, if it's that guidance. Sometimes the shepherd has to wait for the sheep. The shepherd might want to be going ahead, but he has to wait for the sheep to follow along. And as a parent, we do that in gentleness by not provoking our children to wrath, by not getting angry, by not going above and beyond and lashing out in our own flesh. But we have to set that example. Really, we are the standard that our children have. They're only going to follow the example that we set for them. And then further down, now he kind of flips the switch from parents and children to another area of life. And it's bondservants and masters. And this section growing up, and I think in other versions it says slaves and masters. You always, growing up, maybe read it like, well, I'm not a slave. But really what it's talking about here in bondservants is if you're an employee, if you have a job where you go to and your employer sets your hours and they set your wage and they give you work to do, you're a bondservant. You have somebody that is responsible for paying you, for looking after you financially, for the work that you do for them. So this is a very important part of Scripture today as well. Starting in verse 5. Bondservants, be obedient to those who are masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart, as to Christ. Not with eye service as men pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will, doing service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord, whether he is a slave or free. So this is, again, something that can be difficult to do, especially if you have an employee that you find really harsh or that treats you unfairly, that maybe you do the work that they lay out for you, but you don't do it with the right spirit, you don't do it with the right heart. And a lot of times how this looks is that when they're there and they're watching you, you do the work to the best of your ability, but then when maybe they've gone to go supervise somebody else, or they're not in the building, or they've gone to send you to go do something, you slack a little bit, you take that effort down a couple notches. And really what Paul's saying here is that by honoring Christ, we have to have that integrity where no matter who's watching us or how closely we're being supervised, that we're going to do the best because we're doing it for Christ and not for our employer. And this goes we think of this as for harsh employers, but this also goes for employers who treat you really well. A lot of the times, those are the ones that are the easiest to take advantage of because they treat you well, or maybe they don't lead with such a harsh hand, or they have like a hands-off approach where it's like, you do what I've assigned you to do, I'm not going to interfere. And again, that's an opportunity for you as a bondservant or as an employee to take advantage and be like, well, they're not really watching what I'm doing. Even if I mess up a little bit or I take longer than I said I would, they're not really going to care. So here's Paul's just saying that attitude of looking at the employer as who we're trying to satisfy is wrong, that it's Christ who we're working for, and that we should be working as though we're working for him. And then again, Paul flips that script and he says, and you masters, do the same things to them, giving up threatening, knowing that your own master is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. So here Paul turns it to the employers, and he says, treat your employees how Christ treats this church. Treat your employees with respect, honor them, give them work to do, but don't overburden them. Don't treat them unfairly. Don't threaten them. He's saying that, as Christ, it reminds me of the parable where the man who owes money to the rich ruler goes and he begs for forgiveness and says, I can't pay this debt. And it says in that parable that Lord, that master says, your debt's forgiven. And then that servant goes to one of his own servants and says, you owe me something. And it was way less than the other guy owed the master. And it's that understanding that as Christ treats us, we need to treat those who look after our things, who are our servants or our employees, that we treat them with the same respect and same integrity that Christ treats us. And again, it says there's no partiality with him. For Christ, the employer is the same as the employee. It's all that picture of the body of unity, that we're working together and not against each other.